The hospital hallway smelled faintly of antiseptic and something warmer, like coffee that had been sitting too long. It was just past dawn, that quiet hour when the night shift was tired and the day shift had not fully found its rhythm yet. The lights hummed softly above, casting a pale glow over the polished floors. Ion stood near the nurse's station, gently adjusting the sleeves of his uniform. It was only his third week on the job. Everything still felt new, the sounds, the pace, the responsibility. He kept checking his notes, making sure he hadn't forgotten anything. Even small tasks felt important to him. He didn't want to make mistakes. Some of the more experienced nurses moved around him with ease. They spoke quickly, laughed quietly, and handled things with a confidence he admired. Ion stayed mostly silent, observing, learning. He didn't mind being the quiet one. He believed that if he listened carefully enough, he would become better. A senior nurse passed by and gave him a brief nod. "Stay sharp today," she said. "We're expecting a few high-priority cases." He nodded quickly. "Yes, I will." But inside, his chest tightened just a little. High-priority cases meant pressure. And pressure meant he would have to trust himself more than ever. He took a slow breath and looked around the emergency ward. Monitors beeped softly in the distance. A patient coughed somewhere behind a curtain. A trolley rolled past him, wheels squeaking slightly. It all felt overwhelming, yet strangely calm at the same time. He reminded himself why he was here. He remembered long nights studying, his hands trembling before exams, the way his family had looked at him with quiet pride when he finally graduated. This job wasn't just work. It was something he had fought for, something he had promised himself he would do well. Still, the doubts crept in. Was he fast enough? Was he skilled enough? Would he freeze when something serious happened? He shook his head slightly, pushing those thoughts away. There was no room for hesitation here. Just then, the sliding doors at the end of the hallway burst open. 2 paramedics rushed in, pushing a stretcher with urgency. Their faces were tense, their movements sharp. The calm atmosphere shifted instantly, like a switch had been flipped. "Emergency incoming," one of them called out. Ion's heart jumped. The patient on the stretcher was an older man, his face pale, his breathing uneven. His chest rose and fell in short, strained movements. There was something about him, something that felt different, important, though Ion couldn't explain why. A doctor stepped forward immediately, giving quick instructions. "Get him to Bay 3. Monitor vitals. Move." The team moved quickly, and Ion found himself stepping forward without thinking. "Help here," someone said. He reached for the side of the stretcher, guiding it carefully as they rushed down the hallway. His hands felt steady, even though his heart was racing. Inside the treatment area, everything became faster. Machines were turned on. Wires were connected. Voices overlapped, each one focused on saving time. "Pulse is unstable. Blood pressure dropping. Prepare oxygen support." Ion stood close, watching every move. He knew he should assist, but for a moment he hesitated. There were so many things happening at once. Then the doctor glanced at him. "You rookie. Stay with me. Keep track of his breathing and alert me if it worsens." Ion nodded quickly. "Yes, doctor." He stepped closer to the patient, his eyes fixed on the man's chest. He counted each breath carefully. 1, 2, 3. But something didn't feel right. The pattern was irregular. Too shallow. Too fast, then suddenly slow. Ion leaned in slightly, his focus sharpening. The noise around him faded as he concentrated on the one thing he had been told to watch. The patient's hand twitched weakly. Ion noticed. He also noticed the slight change in skin tone, the faint shift that others seemed too busy to catch. His training echoed in his mind. Signs, patterns, small details that could mean something bigger. He swallowed, unsure for a split second. Should he speak? The others were more experienced. Maybe they already knew. Maybe he was overthinking. But then the patient's breathing faltered again. Ion's voice came out before he could stop it. "His breathing is getting worse." The doctor turned immediately. "What?" "It's irregular," Ion said, trying to stay calm. "And slowing. For a brief moment, the room went quieter. The doctor stepped closer, checking quickly. His expression changed. "Good catch," he said sharply. "We need to act now." Everything sped up again, but this time with a different urgency. Instructions came faster. Movements became more precise. Ion stepped back slightly, watching as the team adjusted their approach. His heart was still racing, but something else had replaced the fear. Focus. He stayed close, ready if someone needed him again. The minutes that followed felt longer than they were. Every second carried weight. Every action mattered. At one point, the patient's breathing nearly stopped. Ion felt his chest tighten as he watched. But the team worked quickly, refusing to give up. And slowly, very slowly, the situation began to stabilize. The patient's breathing became more consistent. The monitor's rhythm steadied. A quiet sense of relief spread through the room. The doctor exhaled softly, stepping back. "We've got him stable, for now." Ion felt his shoulders relax, though he hadn't realized how tense he had been. He looked at the patient again. The man still looked fragile, but there was a faint sign of recovery. For a moment, everything felt still again. The doctor glanced at Ion. "You noticed something important. That matters." Ion nodded, unsure what to say. "Stay alert," the doctor added. "Sometimes small details make the biggest difference." Ion took a quiet breath. "Yes, doctor." As the team began organizing the next steps, Ion stepped aside, giving them space. His hands felt slightly shaky now that the rush had passed. He leaned against the counter for a second, collecting himself. He had spoken up, and it had helped. The thought felt almost unreal. Just minutes ago he had been doubting himself, wondering if he even belonged here. Now something had shifted. Not confidence exactly, but something close to it. A quiet belief that maybe, just maybe, he could handle this. Across the room, the patient remained under close observation. Ion couldn't shake the feeling that this case wasn't over yet. There had been something unusual about the urgency when he arrived. Something unspoken in the way the paramedics had acted. And now, even though things had stabilized, there was still a tension in the air, as if everyone was waiting for something. Ion glanced toward the hallway. The early morning calm had returned on the surface, but it felt different now, like the beginning of something bigger. He didn't know why, but he had a strange feeling that this moment, this patient, was going to matter more than he could see. He straightened his posture and stepped back into position, ready to continue his shift. For the first time since he had started, he wasn't just trying to keep up. He was paying attention. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet question lingered. What would happen next? The room slowly settled after the rush, but the tension never truly left. Ion stayed close to the patient, his eyes moving between the monitor and the man's face. The steady beeping sound was reassuring, but it didn't erase the unease he felt. The older man lay still, oxygen mask in place, chest rising more evenly now. Up close, Ion noticed details he hadn't seen before. The man's posture, even in weakness, felt disciplined. His hands, though pale, were strong and marked with faint scars. There was a quiet strength about him, something that spoke of a life filled with responsibility. Ion adjusted the blanket slightly, making sure it covered the patient properly. It was a small action, but it mattered to him. He had always believed that care was not just about medicine, it was also about comfort. A senior nurse stepped beside him, glancing at the chart. "Vitals are holding," she said softly. Ion nodded. "Yes, breathing is more stable too." She gave him a brief look, almost thoughtful. "You did well earlier." The words caught him off guard. He wasn't used to hearing that. "I just noticed something," he replied quietly. "That's exactly what matters," she said, before moving away to assist someone else. Ion stood there for a moment, letting her words sink in. He didn't feel like he had done anything extraordinary, but maybe in a place like this, even small actions could carry weight. The doctor returned, reviewing the monitor and making a few notes. "We'll keep him under observation," he said. "Let's not take any chances." Ion listened carefully, committing every instruction to memory. "Stay with him," the doctor added, looking directly at Ayan again. "If anything changes, you let me know immediately." "Yes, doctor," Ayan replied. As the room quieted, the pace of the hospital seemed to slow again. Outside the curtain, distant footsteps and low voices continued, but inside, it felt like time had softened. Ayan pulled a chair closer and sat down, still watching the patient closely. Every few seconds, his eyes flicked to the monitor, then back again. He noticed the man's breathing had a rhythm now, but it wasn't strong. It felt fragile, like something that could shift at any moment. Minutes passed. Then something unexpected happened. The patient's fingers moved slightly. Ayan leaned forward. The movement was small, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. "Sir," Ayan said gently. The man didn't respond, but his brow tightened faintly, as if he were trying to come back from somewhere far away. Ayan quickly stood up and checked the readings again. Everything looked stable, but the change in movement felt important. He hesitated for a moment, then called out, "Doctor." The doctor returned, stepping in with alert focus. "What is it?" "I think he's regaining some awareness," Ayan said. The doctor observed closely. "Let's see." They both watched as the patient's hand shifted again, this time slightly more noticeable. "Sir, can you hear me?" the doctor asked firmly but calmly. There was a pause. Then, slowly, the man's eyes opened. They didn't fully focus at first. His gaze moved vaguely, as if trying to understand where he was. Ayan felt a quiet sense of relief. The moment felt important, almost fragile. "You're in the hospital," the doctor said. "You're safe. Try not to move too much." The man blinked, his breathing still supported by the mask. His eyes shifted again, this time landing briefly on Ayan. For a second, there was something intense in that look, confusion mixed with awareness. Then his lips moved slightly under the mask, as if he was trying to speak. Ayan leaned in closer. "It's okay," he said softly. "You don't have to talk yet." But the man tried again, his voice barely audible. Ayan couldn't catch the words. The doctor gently placed a hand on the patient's shoulder. "Rest," he said. "You're stable now." The man's eyes slowly closed again, not unconscious this time, but resting. Ayan stepped back, exhaling quietly. "That's a good sign," the doctor said. "Very good." Ayan nodded, feeling a small sense of accomplishment, though he kept it to himself. As the doctor left again, the room returned to its quiet rhythm. But something had changed. The patient was no longer just someone being treated. He was aware now, even if only slightly, and that made everything feel more real. Ayan remained by his side, more attentive than ever. About 15 minutes later, the calm was broken again. This time it wasn't from inside the room. It came from outside. Footsteps, fast, heavy, and coordinated. Voices followed, low but urgent. Ayan turned his head toward the curtain, his attention pulled instantly. Two men appeared at the entrance of the ward. They were dressed differently from the hospital staff. Their posture was straight, their expressions serious. They spoke briefly with someone at the nurse's station, their voices controlled but firm. Ayan couldn't hear the exact words, but he could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The staff around them grew quieter, more focused. One of the men glanced toward the treatment area. Then, unexpectedly, his gaze landed on Ayan. For a brief second, their eyes met. Ayan looked away quickly, unsure why his heart suddenly started racing again. The men didn't enter the room, but they stayed close, watching, waiting. Ayan felt a strange tension build inside him. Who were they? And why did it feel like they were here for this patient? He turned back to the man on the bed, studying him again. The pieces didn't fully connect, but something deep inside told him this situation was not ordinary. The patient's condition, the urgency of his arrival, and now these men. It all pointed to something bigger. Ayan stood up, adjusting the four lines slightly, making sure everything was secure. He tried to focus on his task, but his thoughts kept drifting. The patient shifted again, his breathing steady but light. Ayan leaned closer, watching carefully. "Sir," he said quietly. The man's eyes opened again, this time more focused than before. He looked around slowly, taking in his surroundings. Then his gaze stopped on Ion. For a moment there was silence. Then the man raised his hand slightly, as if trying to signal something. Ion stepped closer. "Do you need something?" The man's voice came out faint but clearer this time. "Time," he whispered. Ion frowned slightly, unsure what he meant. "You've been here for a little while. You're safe." The man shook his head weakly, as if that wasn't what he was asking. His eyes carried urgency now. "How long?" he tried again. "About 30 minutes since you arrived," Ion replied. The man closed his eyes briefly, as if processing that. Then something changed in his expression. Not fear exactly, but concern. Ion noticed it immediately. "What is it?" he asked gently. But the man didn't answer. Instead, his eyes shifted toward the doorway, where the two men still stood outside. Ion followed his gaze, and suddenly the quiet tension made more sense. The patient knew they were there, and whatever the situation was, it wasn't over. Ion felt a chill run through him, though nothing outwardly alarming had happened. The man's breathing picked up slightly again. Not unstable, but different. Ion placed a calming hand near his arm. "Try to stay relaxed. You're being taken care of." The man looked back at him, holding his gaze for a moment. There was something in that look, something that felt like trust, even though they were strangers. Then slowly he nodded. Ion stepped back, his mind still racing. Outside, the two men exchanged a few quiet words. One of them reached for a phone. Ion didn't know why, but he had a strong feeling that whatever came next would change everything. And he realized something else too. This wasn't just another patient anymore. This was a moment that was pulling him deeper into something he didn't fully understand yet. But he couldn't step away now. Not after everything that had already happened. He took a steady breath and stayed right where he was. Watching, waiting, and wondering what would happen next. The air in the room felt heavier now, even though nothing visible had changed. Ion stood near the patient, trying to stay focused on the steady rhythm of the monitor. But his attention kept drifting toward the hallway. The two men outside were still there. They weren't speaking much anymore. One of them had finished his phone call and now stood with his hands behind his back, scanning the area with quiet alertness. The other remained near the nurse's station, speaking softly with a staff member, though his eyes often moved back toward the room. It didn't feel like a coincidence. Ion looked back at the patient. The older man's eyes were open again, more aware this time. His breathing was controlled, but there was a tension in his face that hadn't been there before. "Sir," Ion said gently, stepping closer, "try to stay calm. You're stable, but you need rest." The man studied him for a moment, as if deciding how much to say. Then his gaze shifted again toward the doorway. "They're here," he whispered. Ion hesitated. "Do you know them?" The man didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened slightly, and for a second, he looked like someone carrying a weight much larger than his current condition. "Yes," he said quietly. Ion felt a small knot form in his chest. "Are they a family?" The man almost gave a faint, tired smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "No." That single word left more questions than answers. Before Ion could ask anything else, the curtain at the entrance shifted slightly. One of the men stepped inside, moving with calm but clear purpose. Ion straightened instinctively. The man gave a brief nod toward him, then turned his full attention to the patient. His posture changed the moment he stepped closer, more formal, more precise. "Sir," he said in a low voice. The patient met his gaze. Even lying in the hospital bed, there was something about the way he looked back. Steady, controlled, almost commanding. "You shouldn't be here yet," the patient said faintly. The man's expression didn't change. "We had to come." Ion stepped back slightly, unsure if he should remain or leave. No one had told him to go, but the conversation felt private. Still, he stayed close enough to monitor the patient. "We need you to rest," the man continued. "Everything else can wait." The patient's eyes narrowed just a little. "No," he said, barely above a whisper. "It can't." Ion felt the tension rise again, sharper this time. The man glanced briefly at Ion, then back at the patient. "You're not in a condition to discuss anything right now." "I don't have the luxury to wait," the patient replied, his voice still weak but carrying a quiet firmness. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the man exhaled slowly, as if adjusting his approach. "We've secured the situation. There's no immediate risk." The patient closed his eyes for a second, processing that. But when he opened them again, the concern hadn't fully left. 30 minutes, he murmured. That's how long it took. Ion's mind caught on those words. 30 minutes. The same time he had told the patient earlier. The man beside the bed seemed to understand the meaning behind it. "You were brought here as fast as possible." The patient gave a slight shake of his head. "Too long." Ion felt a quiet chill again. The words weren't panicked, but they carried weight. The man stepped a little closer, lowering his voice. "Sir, with respect, you need to focus on recovering. The rest will be handled." The patient looked at him steadily. Handled doesn't mean understood. Silence followed. Ion stood still, trying not to draw attention, but every word made him more aware that this situation was far beyond anything he had expected when his shift began. The man finally nodded once, slowly. "Understood. But right now, your health comes first." The patient didn't argue this time. Instead, his eyes shifted toward Ion again. For a brief moment, the room felt very small. "You," the patient said quietly. Ion stepped forward. "Yes, sir?" "You were the one who noticed," the man said. Ion hesitated. I just observed your breathing." The patient held his gaze. "That matters." Ion wasn't sure how to respond, so he simply nodded. The man beside the bed looked between them, his expression thoughtful now. "What's your name?" he asked Ion. "Ion," he replied. The man gave a small nod. "You did your job well." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that felt different from earlier praise. Before Ion could respond, the second man entered the room as well. He stepped in quietly but with the same controlled presence. "Everything is in motion," he said to the first man. Ion didn't fully understand what that meant, but it didn't sound casual. The first man acknowledged him with a slight nod. The room felt more crowded now, though no one raised their voice. Ion glanced at the monitor again. The patient's vitals were still stable, but the slight increase in heart rate caught his attention. He stepped closer, adjusting the oxygen mask gently. "Try to relax," he said softly to the patient. The man exhaled slowly, as if making an effort to follow that advice. For a few moments, the tension eased just enough for the room to breathe again. But outside, something new began to build. First, it was faint. A distant sound, almost like a low hum. Ion frowned slightly, turning his head toward the window at the far end of the corridor. The sound grew louder. Not sharp or alarming, just steady, powerful. The two men in the room noticed it too. Their attention shifted instantly. One of them moved toward the doorway, looking out into the hallway. The sound continued to grow, vibrating faintly through the walls now. Ion felt it more than heard it. "What is that?" he asked quietly. No one answered right away. Then, from somewhere down the corridor, a nurse's voice called out, confused and slightly breathless. "Is that helicopters?" The word hung in the air. Ion's heart skipped. Helicopters? At a hospital? The two men exchanged a quick glance. "It's them," one of them said under his breath. Ion looked back at the patient. The older man's eyes were open again, focused despite his condition. He didn't look surprised. If anything, he looked like he had been expecting this. The sound outside grew louder, now unmistakable. The deep, rhythmic thrum of rotor blades filled the air, echoing across the building. Staff members began moving more quickly in the hallway, some heading toward windows, others speaking urgently into phones. The calm of the morning was gone completely now. In its place was something bigger, something organized. Ion felt his pulse quicken as he stepped slightly toward the doorway, unable to ignore the growing noise. Through the distant glass panels, He could see movement on the rooftop access level. Shadows shifting, people gathering, and above it all, the unmistakable presence of something descending. He turned back to the room, his voice barely steady. "There are helicopters." The first man nodded once. "Yes." Ion looked at him, confusion and disbelief mixing together. "Why?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the patient. And in that silence, the answer became clear without being spoken. This wasn't random. This wasn't routine. This was for him. Ion's chest tightened slightly as the realization settled in. The patient he had been watching, the man he had spoken to so simply, was someone far more important than he had imagined. The sound of the helicopters grew louder still, now shaking the very air around them. And Ion stood there, caught between his duty and the overwhelming sense that he had just stepped into something much bigger than himself. Something that was only just beginning. The sound of the helicopters grew louder with every passing second, until it no longer felt like something happening outside the hospital. Felt like it was inside the building itself. The windows vibrated faintly, and the steady hospital noise, beeping machines, distant footsteps, soft voices, began to fade under the weight of the approaching rotor blades. Ion stood near the doorway of the treatment room, unable to fully process what he was hearing. He had seen emergencies before, but never anything like this. The entire atmosphere of the hospital had shifted in a matter of minutes, as if the building itself had recognized something important was happening above it. Inside the room, the patient remained still but alert. His eyes were open, fixed toward the ceiling, as if he could already sense what was arriving. His breathing remained steady under oxygen support, but there was a slight tension in his face again. The two men who had entered earlier now stood more formally. One of them had moved closer to the window, looking upward through the glass panels that led toward the rooftop access. The other stayed near the patient, watching him carefully, as if waiting for a signal. Ion stayed where he was, unsure of his place in all of this. He wasn't part of the conversation. He wasn't part of the decisions being made. But somehow he was still in the middle of it all. A nurse passed quickly in the hallway outside, whispering to another staff member. "Two helicopters. They're landing on the roof." The word spread fast. Within moments, more staff began gathering near the corridor windows, trying to catch a glimpse of what was happening above. Some looked confused. Others looked concerned. But all of them shared the same feeling. This was not a normal hospital event. Ion's attention snapped back to the patient when the man suddenly spoke again. "They're early," the patient said quietly. The man beside him responded without hesitation. "We moved faster than expected." The patient's gaze remained steady. Or something forced the timing. There was a brief silence after that. Ion felt a strange pressure in his chest again. The patient was not speaking like someone recovering from an emergency. He was speaking like someone analyzing a situation, even while lying in a hospital bed. The helicopter sound intensified, now accompanied by a subtle shift in airflow that could be felt even inside the building. Curtains fluttered slightly near the window. Papers on a nearby counter shifted. Ion stepped closer to the monitor, checking the patient's vitals again out of habit. Everything was stable, but the heart rate had increased slightly. Not dangerously, but noticeably. The senior doctor entered the room quickly, drawn by the noise and activity. His expression changed the moment he saw the situation unfolding. "They've arrived?" he asked, looking toward the ceiling as if he could confirm it just by listening. One of the men nodded. "They're landing now." The doctor exhaled slowly, then turned his attention to the patient. "How are you feeling?" The patient didn't answer immediately. His eyes shifted slightly, as if he was weighing the question differently than it was asked. "I'm fine," he said eventually. The doctor didn't look convinced, but he didn't push further. Instead, he checked the monitor readings and gave a small nod. "We'll keep monitoring him. No unnecessary movement." Ion noticed something unusual in the doctor's tone. It wasn't just medical caution. It was respect mixed with caution, as if even the doctor understood that the situation had moved beyond normal hospital protocol. Outside, The helicopter noise began to stabilize into a steady hover. The landing process was happening. Ion had never been on a hospital roof during something like this, but he could imagine it clearly. The wind, the noise, the urgency of movement above them. Then suddenly the sound shifted. One helicopter had clearly landed. The second followed moments later. The building seemed to settle slightly after the weight of the air movement adjusted, but the tension inside the hospital only increased. Footsteps echoed in the upper floors now. Strong, synchronized, purposeful. Ion turned his head toward the hallway just as more staff appeared, some moving aside quickly to make space. The atmosphere had changed from curiosity to alert coordination. Then came the moment that shifted everything again. The elevator doors at the end of the corridor opened. Two figures stepped out. They wore uniforms that immediately stood out. Not hospital staff, not security, but something more structured, more formal. Their posture was disciplined, their movements precise. One of them held a folder, the other scanned the environment immediately upon exiting. The hallway went quieter instantly. Even people who were speaking stopped. The two figures walked forward without hesitation, heading directly toward the treatment room. Ion felt a slight tightening in his stomach as they approached. The man near the window straightened. The other near the patient gave a brief nod of acknowledgement. The first of the arriving figures spoke clearly, his voice calm but authoritative. "We're here for him." There was no need to explain who him was. The patient's eyes shifted toward them. For a moment, the room felt frozen in place. Then the patient spoke. "You took your time." The tone was not angry. It was calm, almost familiar. The second figure responded. "We came as soon as clearance was confirmed." The patient closed his eyes briefly, as if processing that information. Ion remained still, watching every interaction carefully. He felt like he was observing something important without fully understanding its context. The doctor stepped slightly aside, allowing space for the new arrivals. Even he seemed to recognize that his role here was becoming secondary. The first figure approached the bedside but stopped at a respectful distance. "We received the report," he said. "Your condition was unstable during transit." "I'm stable now," the patient replied. "Yes," the man said, glancing at the monitor. "Thanks to early intervention." For the first time, his gaze shifted toward Ion. Ion felt it immediately, that attention. He straightened slightly without meaning to. The man studied him briefly, not unkindly, but with clear interest. "You are the one who flagged the change in condition," he said. Ion hesitated. "I just noticed irregular breathing patterns." The man nodded once. That observation mattered. Ion didn't know how to respond, so he simply nodded back. The second figure stepped closer to the patient now. "We will transfer you shortly." The patient opened his eyes again. "Not yet." There was a pause. The second figure didn't argue immediately. Instead, he looked toward the monitor, then at the doctor, then back to the patient. "Your recovery environment will be controlled during transport," he said. "I know," the patient replied. "But I need a few more minutes here." Ion felt a strange tension in that exchange. It wasn't conflict exactly. It was negotiation. The first figure seemed to understand. "You have limited time." "I always do," the patient said quietly. Silence followed again. The room felt heavier now, filled with unspoken understanding. Ion looked at the patient's face. There was something different in his expression now. Not fear, not confusion, something closer to resolve. The man was preparing for something beyond the hospital, and Ion could feel it even without knowing the details. The first figure finally nodded. 5 minutes. The second added, "After that, we proceed." The patient gave a faint nod in return. Then, slowly, his gaze shifted toward Ion again. "You stayed," he said. Ion blinked slightly. "I was assigned to monitor you." A faint, almost tired expression crossed the patient's face. "Still, you stayed." Ion didn't know why those words felt important, but they did. The patient's breathing remained steady, but his eyes now carried something deeper, reflection, maybe even gratitude. The surrounding staff remained silent, watching the exchange carefully. Outside, the helicopter blades were still turning, though more slowly now, settling into standby mode. The entire hospital felt suspended in a strange balance between urgency and pause. The patient finally spoke again. "What you saw earlier, you did well." Ion lowered his gaze slightly. "I just followed protocol." The patient shook his head faintly. "Not everyone notices what matters in time." That line lingered in the room longer than anything else said that morning. Ion felt it settle inside him in a way he couldn't fully explain. The first figure checked his watch. "We're close." The second nodded. The doctor stepped forward slightly. "He is stable for transfer, but needs careful handling." "We will ensure that," the first figure replied. Ion stepped back as preparations quietly began. But even as movement resumed, even as instructions were given, the patient's eyes remained on Ion for a moment longer. There was something unspoken in that look. Something that made Ion feel like this meeting was not random. It meant something, and even though he didn't yet understand what that meaning was, he had a strong feeling everything was about to change again. The room had shifted into a controlled kind of chaos. Not loud, not panicked, but full of movement, instructions, and quiet urgency. Every person inside seemed to understand that something important was happening, even if they didn't fully know the reason. Ion stood slightly behind the medical team, watching as they prepared the patient for transfer. A portable monitor was brought in. For lines were checked again. Oxygen support was adjusted carefully. Every movement was precise, as if even the smallest mistake mattered more than usual. The patient lay still but alert. His eyes followed the people around him calmly, as though he had already accepted what was coming next. There was no fear in his expression, only awareness. The two formal figures who had arrived earlier stayed close. One of them spoke quietly into a communication device, confirming timing and readiness. The other observed the medical team with quiet focus, making sure everything was aligned. The doctor gave final instructions. Keep him stable during movement. No sudden changes in position. The nurse beside him nodded. Understood. Ion stepped forward slightly when he was needed to help adjust a cable. His hands were steady, but his mind wasn't fully calm anymore. The past hour had felt like a long stretch of events that didn't belong in his normal hospital routine. He kept thinking about how it had started. A simple emergency case. Patient in distress. And now, helicopters, officials, and a coordinated transfer that felt more like a protected operation than a medical evacuation. The patient turned his head slightly toward Ion again. "You're still here," he said softly. Ion hesitated for a second. "I'm assisting the team." The patient's expression softened slightly. "You didn't have to stay this long." Ion didn't know how to respond to that honestly. He could have been moved to another task. He could have stepped away after the emergency stabilized. But something about the situation had kept him rooted there. So he simply said, "I was assigned here." The patient gave a faint nod, but there was something knowing in his eyes, like he understood more than what was being said. The second formal figure stepped closer to the stretcher. "We are ready to move." The doctor nodded once. "Careful movement. Keep his head stable." The stretcher was adjusted. Locking mechanisms clicked softly into place. The team gathered around it in a coordinated formation. Ion moved slightly back to give space. For a moment, everything paused. Not physically, but emotionally. Like the entire room was waiting for a signal to move forward. Then it began. Slowly, carefully, the stretcher was lifted. The patient's eyes remained open, steady. His breathing stayed controlled. The monitor beeped at a stable rhythm. Ion walked alongside for a few steps without realizing it. Not too close, just enough to observe. As they moved toward the hallway, the atmosphere outside the room shifted again. Staff who had been waiting nearby stepped aside. Conversations stopped. Even those who didn't know the full situation sensed that something significant was passing through. The group moved toward the elevator that led to the rooftop access. Each step felt heavier than the last. Not because of physical weight, but because of meaning. When they reached the elevator, the doors opened immediately, as if already prepared. The stretcher was guided inside first. The medical team followed. The two formal figures entered after them. Ion stood outside for a second, unsure if he was meant to follow further. The patient looked toward him one last time before the doors closed. There was no request, no command, just a look. Ion stepped forward instinctively, entering the elevator just before the doors fully closed. No one stopped him. The elevator began to rise. The movement was smooth, but the silence inside felt heavier than before. No one spoke. Only the soft sound of machinery and the occasional beep from the monitor filled the space. Ion stood near the back corner, trying to remain unnoticed. But the patient's eyes found him again. "You didn't leave," the patient said quietly. Ion shook his head slightly. "I wasn't told to." A faint expression crossed the patient's face, something like a tired smile. "That's not why," he said. Ion didn't respond. The elevator continued upward. Each floor passed with a soft chime and a subtle shift in air pressure. The atmosphere grew brighter as they approached the rooftop level. Finally, the doors opened. The sound hit them immediately. The helicopter blades were still spinning above, creating a powerful wind that rushed across the rooftop landing area. The sky was pale, early morning light spreading across the hospital roof. Medical personnel and uniformed staff were already in position, waiting. Everything was organized. Everything was ready. The stretcher was carefully rolled out onto the rooftop. Ion followed, shielding his eyes slightly from the wind. The patient remained calm despite the noise and movement. His eyes were open, scanning the environment, but still composed. One of the helicopters stood nearby, its side door open, crew ready for transfer. The second hovered at a safe distance, maintaining position. A coordinated team stepped forward to assist with loading. But before the transfer began, the patient spoke again. "Wait." The word wasn't loud, but it stopped everything instantly. Movement paused. Hands froze. Even the wind seemed less important in that moment. The senior figure closest to the stretcher turned. "Sir." The patient looked toward the edge of the rooftop, then back toward Ion. "I want him here," he said. The words were simple, but they landed heavily. Ion blinked slightly, unsure if he had heard correctly. The senior figure looked at the patient. "That is not standard protocol." The patient's gaze didn't move. "I know." Pause followed. The wind continued to rush around them. The helicopter blades kept spinning. But inside that moment, everything else felt still. The patient turned his head slightly more toward Ion. "You noticed before anyone else," he said. "That means something." Ion felt a strange pressure in his chest again. "I just reported what I saw. That's why it mattered," the patient replied. The senior figure exchanged a brief look with the doctor. There was hesitation, but also recognition of the patient's authority. After a moment, the senior figure nodded once. "Fine." Briefly. Ion's heart rate increased slightly as he stepped closer. He didn't fully understand why he had been asked to come forward, but he obeyed. Now he stood near the stretcher, close enough to hear the patient clearly over the wind. The patient studied him for a moment, then spoke quietly. "You're new here," he said. "Yes," Ion replied. "Do you know why I'm here?" the patient asked. Ion hesitated. "No, sir." The patient looked toward the helicopter for a second, then back at him. "There are things that don't always come with explanation," he said. Ion didn't know how to respond to that. The patient continued, voice still calm. "You acted without hesitation earlier. That is rare." Ion lowered his gaze slightly. "I only did what I thought was needed." The patient nodded faintly. "That's what matters most." For a moment, neither spoke. The wind filled the silence between them. Then the patient added something softer. "People like you keep systems working when they start to fail." Ion felt the weight of that sentence, even if he didn't fully understand its meaning in a larger sense. The senior figure stepped forward again. "We must proceed." The patient gave a small nod. He looked at Ion one final time. "This is not the last time our paths will cross," he said. Ion didn't know why those words felt significant, but they did. Before he could respond, the stretcher was carefully lifted again. This time, There was no hesitation. The team moved forward, guiding the patient toward the helicopter. Ion stepped back as the transfer began. The rotor blades grew louder as the stretcher was secured inside. Medical staff moved quickly but carefully. Everything was controlled, efficient, practiced. The patient was gently positioned inside the aircraft. For a brief moment, before the door closed, his eyes met Ion's again. Not with urgency, not with concern, but with something closer to quiet acknowledgement. Then the door closed. The helicopter lifted slowly, wind intensifying across the rooftop. Ion stood there, watching it rise into the sky. The second helicopter followed shortly after. Within minutes, both were gone. The rooftop slowly quieted. The wind softened. The noise faded into the distance. Ion remained standing for a moment longer, staring at the empty space where everything had just unfolded. Behind him, hospital staff began to disperse, returning to normal duties. Conversations resumed. The world slowly rebuilt its usual rhythm. But Ion didn't move right away. Something inside him had changed. Not dramatically, not loudly, but deeply. He had started the morning as a rookie nurse trying to find his place. And now, he wasn't sure what he was anymore. He turned slowly and walked back toward the elevator. The hospital felt the same as before, but he didn't, because somewhere in the middle of all that chaos, helicopters, silence, and brief words exchanged on a rooftop, he had stepped into something far bigger than a routine shift, and he had no idea yet just how far it would take him.